I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking about the process, how this book was created. For those of you who've had an opportunity to either read the book or see some of the excerpts, there's been a couple out there now. I thought I could walk you through a little bit of that because I seem to get a lot of questions about how and why these people would ever tell me some of the things they did. And then I thought I'd talk a little bit about the story and really, without ruining it, hopefully where the surprises are. And finally, a little bit about hopefully some of the lessons that have been learned, which was really more than anything the goal when I started this project, which was I considered what happened over the past year in an odd way a mystery. You know, you talked about it being a suspense thriller, and one of the hard things to do as an author is, especially when you know the end of the story, how to construct something so that there's enough surprises and new information and new twists and turns to really engage the reader. The book, for me, started, like it probably did for many of you, on September 15th. September 15th, 2008 was the Monday after Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy at 1:45 a.m. in the morning. Merrill Lynch had been sold to Bank of America, and AIG, I had just finished writing the front page story, was now teetering. It was the new domino that most of us had actually not been focused on at that time. And I got home, and it was about 2:30 in the morning, and I was, excited is the wrong word, freaked out is probably closer to the word, and wanted to talk to somebody, anybody, about what had just happened. I couldn't even believe what had happened, and I sort of had a front row seat for most of the weekend because I had been working the phones trying to figure out the story. And so, of course, the only person I could talk to was someone who was sleeping, which was my wife, whom I woke up and was none too happy to hear about any of this. I'm not sure that she thought it was that interesting or that she cared. And I, of course, to me, this was also dramatic, and I told her the whole story, and I said, you know, it's like a movie. And she's a literary agent, and she sort of looked at me for half a second before rolling over, and she looked and said, no, it's like a book, Andrew. And so that's how this all began. And for the next week or two, I didn't really want to write a book. I'd never written more than, frankly, a couple thousand words in the newspaper, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 words, and was very daunted by the idea of ever putting together as many chapters as in this book. I actually, when I started, don't be freaked out, by the way, by the size of the book. I know it's a little thick, but that was not the ambition. It's thick paper, but it reads like Danielle Steele. So for the next couple of weeks, I continued to be reporting for the New York Times, and the story took on a life of its own. It wasn't just a story about Lehman Brothers anymore or about AIG. It was about capitalism and socialism and government intervention and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, and all of these other things happened. And I guess a week or two later, I started really thinking about the book, and happily, in the midst of the crisis, I was, I guess, a vulture, if you will. I took advantage of the crisis and sold this book, and then spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out what the book could be. For better or worse, I actually didn't really know when I started this, except that I knew that there was a puzzle that needed to be put together, and that there was much more that it must have happened behind the scenes than, frankly, the headlines that I had been writing with others. And my goal, in a way, was to get behind the scenes and to tell this almost as a human drama. I've covered Wall Street for the past 10 years, and I thought of this, frankly, less about institutions in a way that were too big to fail, so much as I thought about it as people who, in their own way, thought they were too big to fail. And I wanted to tell that story from a human perspective, because I thought that so many of these people, I think from the outside, we think of them as infallible. And frankly, they're actually not, they may be wealthier, but they're not that different than the rest of the world. And then I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out structure. People think about how do you structure a book? It's something I had not thought much about. And you know, people were doing books about Bear Stearns and about Lehman Brothers and all of these things, but to me it was really about the interconnectedness of all of these people that I knew. And you had lawyers and bankers and people who were on all sides of these things, 20 ways and backwards, and it was how do you tell the story of all of these things, because in the end they were all connected. And I saw or resaw a movie called Crash, if anybody knows that movie. And that is actually the model for the book, which is that you're really telling the story of 3 or 4 or 5 different plot lines, if you will, that are all seem to be happening somewhat independently of each other, but of course they're not independent at all. And as the story progresses, they cataclysmically, in this case, come together. And that's the way I saw this. And I saw Lehman Brothers being one strand of the story, Dick Fold being a major protagonist as part of that strand. I saw the government, Hank, Tim, and Ben. I now use them all by first name. I know that probably I shouldn't be doing that. And then AIG being another strand, Merrill Lynch being another strand. And frankly, when I started, I didn't know where Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley would be. I didn't think they would be a huge component of the piece, but of course they become their own storylines. And JP Morgan, oddly enough, ends up being the glue between many of these strands because of their involvement. I don't think they have their own plot line per se, but you see them sort of pop up back and forth. And then I went about trying to get what ended up being over 200 people to sit with me, and in the end they sat with me for over 500 hours to really try to reconstruct the record. And that was the goal of this project more than anything else, to understand where the pivotal moments lay, where the meetings were, who was saying what to whom. And I started by doing only a handful of interviews, and I wanted to do it all on the record. And I sat there with my tape recorder, and it was not going very well, I must tell you. And people said, a CEO said to me about three interviews into me, said, you know, Bob Woodward or Jim Stewart would never do it this way. If you really want to know what I said to my wife, you know, I can't do this on the record. And so I actually switched in some ways sort of my approach, which was to do this all on a sort of background basis so that everybody would have carte blanche, frankly, to tell me everything. But if you were to ask me whether Hank Paulson participated in this book, I wouldn't tell you. And that's how and why I think actually so many people did participate in this book. The other thing that was remarkable about the experience was just how much people told me and how many pieces of notes they actually kept. That was something I did not expect. I didn't think that during this crisis, A, that they would have had time to keep notes, B, that in some cases some of them would be stupid enough to keep notes, and 3, how many people were privy to so many of these conversations. And so one of the things that happened actually very early on was I met with a CEO who sat down and he came with his notes from that fateful weekend at the Federal Reserve. And these notes, I will tell you, were better than any reporter's notes I'd ever seen in my life. You know, he had Paulson, quote. He had actually drawn out contemporaneously at the time where everybody sat at the table. And I said to him, and at the end of the meeting, he literally hands me the folder. Says, good luck. And I said, why are you giving me this stuff? And he said, for the same reason I took the notes. I thought, you know, this was history in the making. And so I think that for some people, I don't want to say all people, because there was a lot of spinning that went on later, and we'll get to that. But for some people, it was about reconstructing the historical record, and people felt, oddly enough, in that very moment that they were part of history. The other piece of it, which I didn't appreciate as a reporter, and I do this at the paper, but not in this way, is once you get to a certain point, there were some people who didn't want to play at all, if you will, right? So I would call them up. They would say, I'm not going to do an interview with you. This is crazy. Why would I ever do that? There becomes a moment where you can tell them, listen, I know you're at John Mack's house at 10:30 in the morning on this specific Saturday morning. I know the 5 people who were there were these 5 people. I know that you were eating a chicken wrap sandwich at about noon and that your son called because he was late for the lacrosse game. And when you get to that point in the reporting process, those who are less inclined to participate sometimes feel persuaded, if you will, that maybe it's a good idea.